She was the only woman in the world who could claim that her husband killed the devil, and yet, for 50 years, she barely spoke a word about it. To the modern world, Princess Irina Alexandrovna is a ghost, a silent footnote in the flamboyant, blood-soaked saga of Grigory Rasputin's murder. You might know her face from grainy black and white photographs, a woman with large, melancholic eyes, sitting beside a man who looked like a decadent angel. That man was Prince Felix Yusupov, the wealthiest aristocrat in Russia and the self-confessed assassin of the Mad Monk. But the woman was far more than just the assassin's wife. She was the bait. The magnitude of Irina's tragedy can only be measured by the terrifying height from which she fell. Her story doesn't begin in the blood-spattered cellar of the Moika Palace. It begins in the blinding gold light of the late 19th century, at the very zenith of the Russian Empire's power. Born on July 15, 1895, at the Peterhof Palace, the Russian Versailles, on the edge of the Gulf of Finland, she was not merely a member of the aristocracy. She was the blood of the blood, the flesh of the Romanov dynasty. Her mother was Grand Duchess Xenia, the eldest daughter of Tsar Alexander III, and the sister of the future Tsar Nicholas II. Her father was Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, known as Sandro, a naval officer and mystic who walked a fine line between royal duty and a deep simmering cynicism about the future of the monarchy. Irina was the first grandchild of the fearsome Tsar Alexander III, the peacemaker who could bend silver rubles with his bare hands. Her birth was heralded by a 101-gun salute that rattled the windows of St. Petersburg, announcing to the world that a new high priestess of the autocracy had arrived. But from her earliest moments, it was clear that Irina was different. She was not like her boisterous, healthy cousins who would later captivate the world, the Grand Duchesses Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Irina possessed a distinct, almost haunting beauty that seemed to belong to a different century. She had the Romanov face, long, aristocratic, with deep, dark eyes that seemed to hold a reservoir of sorrow, long before she had anything to be sad about. As a child, she was painfully shy, speaking in a whisper, hiding behind the skirts of her formidable mother. She grew up in a world where the floorboards were polished with beeswax, and the air smelled of French perfume and Russian leather, a world where revolution was just a word whispered by the servants, not a monster waiting at the gate. Her childhood was a gilded cage, constructed of immense privilege and profound isolation. While the world outside the palace walls was beginning to churn with the smoke of factories and the whispers of socialism, Irina's world was a timeless bubble of rituals. She spent her winters in the palaces of St. Petersburg, where the temperature was kept at a tropical warmth to ward off the Russian chill, and her summers at Todor, her father's estate in the Crimea. It was here, by the warm waters of the Black Sea, that Irina's soul was formed. Unlike the stiff German formality of the imperial court, Todor was a place of wild beauty, of cypress trees and vineyards, where the air smelled of salt and jasmine. Her father, Sandro, was a liberal influence, teaching his daughter to think, to question, and to look beyond the rigid protocols of her rank. But her mother, Xenia, was a Romanov to her marrow, terrified of the outside world, obsessively religious and fiercely protective. Irina grew up caught between these two poles, the desire for freedom and the paralyzing weight of her duty. But if the Romanovs were the gods of this world, there was another family in Russia that was perhaps even more fascinating and certainly more dangerous, the Yusupovs. And it is impossible to tell Irina's story without weaving in the thread of the man who would define her existence. While Irina was learning her French verbs and practicing her curtsy in the nursery of the Winter Palace, a boy named Felix was growing up in the Moika Palace on the other side of the city. The Yusupovs were not royal, but in terms of sheer liquid wealth, they made the Romanovs look like country gentry. Their fortune was older than the dynasty itself, rooted in the Tatars of the Golden Horde. Legend had it that their ancestors had eaten the flesh of their enemies to gain their strength. They owned 125 miles of coastline on the Caspian Sea, oil fields, iron mines, and so much land that they allegedly didn't know the exact boundaries of their own estates. Their jewelry collection included the Polar Star diamond, the Sultan of Morocco diamond, and the legendary La Pellegrina pearl, which had once belonged to Philip II of Spain. But with the money came the Yusupov curse. A family legend claimed that due to an ancestor's apostasy, only one male heir in each generation would live past the age of 26. All others would die violently. It was a dark fairy tale that seemed to hold true. Felix had an elder brother, Nicholas, a dashing, artistic young man who was the hope of the family. But in 1908, Nicholas fell in love with a married woman and was killed in a duel on the Krestovsky Island, shot through the heart at dawn. His death left Felix as the sole heir to the unimaginable fortune and the terrifying weight of the curse. Felix Yusupov was the enfant terrible of Russia. He was breathtakingly beautiful, with a face that looked like a Renaissance painting of a fallen angel, fine-boned, languid, with heavy-lidded eyes that seemed to mock the world. He was everything Irina was not: loud, scandalous, decadent. By all logic, they should never have met. While Irina was attending church services and tea parties, Felix was cross-dressing and sneaking into the cabarets of St. Petersburg, singing soprano, fooling even the officers of the Imperial Guard who tried to court the mysterious French actress. He walked his pet bulldog through the streets wearing a string of diamonds. He smoked opium. He dabbled in the occult. He was the physical embodiment of the empire's decay, beautiful, rotten, and utterly mesmerized by his own reflection. She was the Tsar's favorite niece, a vessel of purity and royal dignity. He was the scandal of the city, a man whose reputation was so sordid that mothers would cross the street to avoid him. The Dowager Empress Marie Feodorovna, the matriarch of the Romanov clan, despised the Yusupovs, viewing them as dangerously independent and morally bankrupt. When rumors began to circulate that the young Prince Yusupov had his eyes on Princess Irina, the reaction in the Winter Palace was one of horror. But history is often driven by the inexplicable magnetism of opposites. They met in the Crimea, that sun-drenched playground of the aristocracy. Felix, broken by the death of his brother and exhausted by his own debauchery, saw in Irina something he had never encountered in the salons of Paris or the nightclubs of St. Petersburg. He saw absolute, unshakable calm. She was not impressed by his wealth. She had her own. She was not shocked by his reputation. She seemed to look right through it. In his memoirs, Felix would later write that he saw in her a spiritual elevation that promised to heal his fractured soul. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a savior. He called her his guardian angel, a title that would prove to be a heavy burden for a young girl to carry. For Irina, the attraction was equally complex. Why did the shy, silent princess choose the bisexual, cross-dressing prince? Perhaps she was tired of the suffocating perfection of her life. Perhaps, like many women of her class, she was drawn to the broken wing, believing she could fix him. Or perhaps she saw in Felix the one thing the Romanov court lacked: freedom. He did what he wanted. He lived without fear of consequence. To a girl raised in a gilded cage, Felix must have looked like the open sky, the courtship was a battle. Irina's parents were skeptical. The Dowager Empress was apoplectic. But Irina, usually so pliable, discovered a vein of iron in her character. She wanted Felix. She refused to consider the other suitors, the boring German princes, the safe English cousins. She engaged in a quiet war of attrition, wearing down her family's resistance with her silence and her stubbornness. Finally, the Tsar himself gave his consent. It was a decision that Nicholas II would likely have been too distracted to overthink, his mind already occupied by the rumblings of war and the hemophilia of his son. But it was a decision that sealed Irina's fate. The wedding of Princess Irina Alexandrovna and Prince Felix Yusupov took place on February 22, 1914, in the chapel of the Anichkov Palace. It was the last great social event of Imperial Russia, the final apotheosis of a world that was about to commit suicide. The descriptions of that day read like a fantasy novel, almost too lush to be real. Irina walked down the aisle wearing a dress of silver satin that seemed to liquefy under the candlelight. On her head, she wore a veil of rock crystal lace that had once belonged to Marie Antoinette, a chilling omen given the French queen's fate, but in 1914 it was just seen as a symbol of exquisite taste. The Tsar, in a gesture of immense affection, gave his niece a bag containing 29 uncut diamonds, stones of such size and clarity that they could have funded a small war. The reception was a blur of gold plate, French champagne, and the glitter of 1,000 tiaras. The cream of the Russian aristocracy was there, the grand dukes in their uniforms, the society beauties in their Parisian gowns, the ambassadors of Europe watching with envious eyes. It was a gathering of ghosts. Within 4 years, almost everyone in that room would be dead, exiled, or destitute. But for that one frozen moment, the illusion held. The Romanovs were eternal. The Yusupovs were invincible. And Irina and Felix were the golden couple of the age, standing at the altar of a cathedral that smelled of incense and eternity, unaware that the ground beneath their feet was already turning to ash. The newlyweds departed for their honeymoon, traveling across Europe, visiting Paris, London, and Egypt. It was a tour of the old world in its twilight. They traveled in a private railway car, surrounded by servants, buying art, meeting kings, living in a bubble of luxury that insulated them from the rising tensions of the continent. But even on their honeymoon, the shadows were lengthening. In Jerusalem, Felix, prone to religious mania, had a vision of doom. In London, they sensed the nervous energy of a society on the brink. They returned to St. Petersburg in the summer of 1914, just as the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. The dominoes began to fall. The declarations of war were signed. The bands played God Save the Tsar in the squares. The First World War had begun. For Irina, the war meant a sudden, brutal contraction of her world. The balls stopped. The palaces were turned into hospitals. Her husband Felix did not go to the front. As the only surviving son, he was exempt from the draft, a fact that caused immense resentment among the patriots of St. Petersburg. While other young aristocrats were dying in the mud of Galicia, Felix was in the capital, organizing hospitals, but also continuing his life of strange, nervous idleness. He began to attend military academies, but his heart wasn't in it. He was watching the collapse of his world with a growing sense of horror. The war exposed the rot inside the Russian Empire, and at the center of that rot, in the eyes of the aristocracy, stood one man, Grigory Rasputin. The Siberian peasant who had bewitched the Empress Alexandra was seen by the Romanov clan not as a holy man, but as a cancer eating away at the throne. While millions of Russian soldiers died for lack of ammunition, Rasputin was accused of puppeteering the government, appointing incompetent ministers, and debauching the capital with his drunken orgies. The hatred for Rasputin was the one thing that united the monarchists and the revolutionaries. He was the scapegoat for every failure, the symbol of the regime's spiritual death. Irina, living in the Moika Palace, watched her husband's obsession with Rasputin grow. Felix became convinced that Rasputin was the Antichrist. He believed with the feverish intensity of a man who has read too many bad novels that if he could just remove this one man, the spell would break, the Tsar would regain his senses, the war would be won, and the golden world of 1914 would return. It was a naive aristocratic delusion, but it was a dangerous one. Felix began to plot. He gathered a small circle of conspirators, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, Vladimir Purishkevich, and a few others. They needed a plan. They needed a place. And most importantly, they needed a lure. Rasputin was suspicious. He knew people wanted him dead. He rarely went out at night and never to the homes of people he didn't trust. But Rasputin had a weakness. He was fascinated by the high aristocracy, by the blue blood that he simultaneously despised and coveted. And there was one woman in St. Petersburg who fascinated him more than any other, Princess Irina. Rasputin had never met Irina socially. She avoided him. Her parents despised him, but he had seen her photographs. He knew of her reputation, the icy, untouchable beauty, the niece of the Tsar, the wife of the richest man in Russia. To Rasputin, Irina was the ultimate prize, the forbidden fruit. He believed she was suffering from nervous disorders that only he could cure. He pestered Felix for an introduction, and so the trap was set. Felix Yusupov, the man who had sworn to protect Irina, the man who called her his guardian angel, decided to use her as the cheese in the mousetrap. He told Rasputin that Irina wanted to meet him. He hinted that she was unhappy, that she needed spiritual guidance, and, more darkly, that she might be open to his advances. He invited the holy man to the Moika Palace for a private midnight supper, promising him that Irina would be there, waiting to entertain him. The stage was set for a murder that would echo through history, but there was one crucial detail that Felix left out of his conversation with Rasputin, a detail that would haunt Irina for the rest of her life. The trap was baited with a lie, a deception so profound it would echo through history. As the snow began to fall on St. Petersburg, sealing the city in a globe of ice and silence, the stage was set for a tragedy that would rely entirely on the presence of a woman who was nowhere near the scene of the crime. The night of December 29, 1916, was bitterly cold, the kind of Russian winter that freezes breath in the throat and turns the Neva River into a jagged highway of ice. Inside the Moika Palace, in a basement room that had been hastily converted into a dining boudoir, Prince Felix Yusupov was pacing the floor. He had spent days preparing this stage set. He had laid down Persian rugs to muffle the sound of falling bodies. He had bought expensive furniture to create an atmosphere of intimacy. He had placed a crucifix on the wall, perhaps in a cynical nod to the holy work he was about to commit, or perhaps out of a genuine, terrified desire for absolution. On the table sat a plate of cream cakes and bottles of Madeira wine. Both the cakes and the wine were laced with enough potassium cyanide to kill a regiment of Cossacks. But the most important element of the trap was not the poison, nor the gun hidden in Felix's pocket. It was the lie. The bait was Irina. Upstairs, a gramophone was playing Yankee Doodle on a loop, a manic, cheerful tune designed to cover the sounds of struggle and to simulate a party. Felix had told Rasputin that Irina was entertaining guests on the floor above and would join them shortly. He knew that the monk's infatuation with the Tsar's niece was the only force strong enough to lure him out of his fortress apartment. Rasputin, usually so paranoid, so tuned into the vibrations of danger, had walked into the lion's den because he believed a goddess was waiting for him. But Irina was not upstairs. She was not even in St. Petersburg. She was 1,000 miles away in the Crimea, at her father's estate in Corrèze. This physical absence is the pivot upon which the moral weight of the story turns. For weeks leading up to the murder, Felix had written to Irina, hinting at his plan, trying to recruit her as an accomplice. His letters were a mix of revolutionary fervor and manic desperation. He wanted her to be the Joan of Arc of the assassination, the pure vessel that would sanctify the bloody deed. But Irina had recoiled. In her surviving letters, we see a woman gripped by a profound spiritual dread. She did not like Rasputin. She believed, like the rest of her family, that he was destroying the dynasty. But the idea of murder, of trapping a human being like a rat, revolted her. She had written back to Felix, urging caution, expressing a dark foreboding. "I have a bad feeling about this," she wrote. She refused to come north. She refused to be the lure. Felix, driven by his obsession, simply ignored her refusal. If he couldn't have the real Irina, he would use her image instead. As Rasputin sat in that basement, eating the poisoned cakes and drinking the poisoned wine, he kept asking, "Where is she? When will she come down?" Felix, sweating in his tuxedo, his nerves stretched to the breaking point, kept lying. "She has a headache. She is just saying goodbye to her guests. She will be here in a moment." For hours, the phantom of Irina Alexandrovna hovered in that room. Her name was the promise that kept Rasputin in his chair while the cyanide failed to work. Her image was the last thing on the monk's mind as the poison refused to take hold, forcing Felix to resort to more brutal methods. When Felix finally drew his Browning revolver and shot Rasputin in the chest, he was killing the man who had come to see his wife. The bullet that pierced the monk's heart was fired by the husband, but the invitation had been signed, in spirit if not in ink, by the wife. When the news broke the next morning, it hit the Russian Empire like a physical blow. A policeman had heard the shots. Blood was found in the snow of the Moika courtyard, and then the body was pulled from the river, frozen into a grotesque final pose, hands raised as if trying to claw through the ice. In the Crimea, the news reached Irina not as a triumph, but as a catastrophe. She was sitting in the sunroom of the Itodor estate when the telegrams began to arrive. The first reports were confused, but the central fact was undeniable. Felix had done it. He had killed the friend, and he had done it in their home using her name. The psychological impact on Irina must have been shattering. She was 21 years old. She was a Romanov, raised in a culture where honor was everything. Now her name was being shouted by newsboys on every street corner in Europe, linked forever to a sordid basement murder. The Empress Alexandra, her aunt, was hysterical with grief and rage. She demanded that Felix be shot. She wrote to the Tsar, "He has killed our friend. He has killed Russia." To the Empress, Irina was no longer a niece. She was the wife of the Antichrist. Irina faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could have denounced Felix. She could have claimed ignorance, which was true, and separated herself from the crime. The Romanov family would have protected her. She could have divorced the murderer and salvaged her reputation. It would have been the easy, logical path. But Irina Alexandrovna did not do easy. In a display of loyalty that bordered on the terrifying, she packed her trunks and traveled north, straight into the eye of the storm. She returned to St. Petersburg not to apologize, but to stand beside her husband. She found Felix under house arrest in the Dmitri Palace. the hero of the hour to the public, but a pariah to the Tsar. The city was in a frenzy. People were lighting candles for Felix in the churches, hailing him as the savior who had cleansed the throne. But inside the palace, the mood was grim. The Tsar, torn between his wife's demand for vengeance and the public's support for the murder, chose a middle path: exile. Felix was banished to his estate in Rakitnoy in the remote Kursk province. It was a soft punishment, a slap on the wrist for a capital crime, but it meant banishment from the court and the capital. Irina went with him. They boarded the train together, the murderer and the bait, leaving behind the Moika Palace with its blood-stained basement, heading into the vast, snowy emptiness of the Russian interior. It was during this exile in Rakitnoy that the true nature of their marriage was forged. Away from the parties, the drugs, and the sycophants of St. Petersburg, they were just two young people trapped in a country house while the world ended. Irina did not scold Felix. She did not weep over her ruined reputation. She simply endured. She became his anchor. When Felix would spiral into manic episodes, reliving the murder, obsessing over the details, Irina would calm him down. She understood, perhaps better than he did, that he hadn't saved Russia. He had merely kicked the door open for the revolution, and the revolution was coming fast. In February 1917, less than 3 months after the murder, the dam broke. The bread riots in St. Petersburg turned into a general strike. The garrison mutinied. The Tsar, stranded on his train, abdicated the throne. In the blink of an eye, the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty evaporated. For Irina and Felix, the news of the abdication was a death warrant. They were members of the imperial family, and they were the owners of the greatest fortune in Russia. To the Bolsheviks, they were the ultimate class enemies. The peasants on the Yusupov estates, who had once bowed to them, now looked at them with cold, calculating eyes. The fences were torn down. The livestock was stolen. The red rooster, the slang for arson, began to crow in the night as manor houses burned across the horizon. Realizing that Rakitnoy was a trap, the family made a desperate decision to flee south back to the Crimea. The Crimea was the Romanovs' last redoubt, a peninsula of relative safety where the Dowager Empress and other Grand Dukes had gathered. The journey south was a descent into chaos. The trains were no longer the luxurious express liners of the past. They were filthy, overcrowded cattle cars, teeming with deserters and revolutionaries. Irina and Felix, disguised as ordinary citizens, had to fight for space. They saw the new face of Russia, angry, hungry, and violent. At every station, they risked being recognized. If a sailor or a soldier had pointed a finger and shouted, "That's Yusupov, that's the Tsar's niece," they would have been torn to pieces on the platform. They reached the Crimea in the spring of 1917, gathering at the Itodor estate. It was a surreal gathering of the eagles. The Dowager Empress Marie Feodorovna was there, refusing to believe her son, the Tsar, had truly fallen. Irina's parents, Grand Duchess Xenia and Grand Duke Sandro, were there, and so were Irina and Felix, bringing with them the dark glamour of the Rasputin murder. For the next 2 years, the Crimea became a golden cage. The provisional government placed the Romanovs under house arrest. They were prisoners in their own palaces. Their correspondence was censored. Their guards were rude, often entering their bedrooms without knocking, blowing smoke in the Grand Duchess's faces. But for Irina, this period was also a time of strange, poignant beauty. Stripped of their duties, the family grew closer. They gardened. They swam in the sea. They played bridge in the evenings while the world burned outside the gates. Irina, now a mother to a toddler daughter, focused entirely on survival. She sewed jewels into the linings of her corsets and her child's teddy bears. She learned to cook. She learned to negotiate with the guards. The situation turned critical in late 1917 when the Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution. The provisional government, which had been relatively polite, was replaced by the Soviets. The guards at Aitodor were replaced by hardline revolutionaries. The Yalta Soviet, the local council of workers and sailors, began to debate openly not if they should kill the Romanovs, but when and how. The family was moved to the Julber estate, a fortress-like palace with high walls designed by Grand Duke Peter Nikolaevich. It became their Alamo. Inside the walls, a few dozen Romanovs and their loyal retainers waited for death. Outside, the Yalta Soviet set up machine guns, pointing them at the windows. This is one of the most cinematic and underreported chapters of Irina's life. The man in charge of their captivity was a giant Bolshevik sailor named Zadorozhny. He was a brute, a man who had murdered officers in the Black Sea Fleet. The Yalta Soviet demanded he hand the prisoners over for execution. But Zadorozhny, in a twist of fate that defies fiction, developed a strange respect for his captives. He had served under Grand Duke Alexander in the Navy before the war. He remembered the tall Grand Duke as a fair commander. So instead of killing them, Zadorozhny decided to protect them. He told the Yalta Soviet that he was keeping the prisoners for a future trial in Moscow. When the local mob tried to storm the palace to lynch the Romanovs, Zadorozhny and his band of sailors set up a perimeter, turning their guns outward to defend the imperial family against the revolutionaries. For weeks, Irina lived in the crosshairs of a civil war within a civil war. At night, they could hear the arguments at the gate, the mob screaming for their blood, and Zadorozhny shouting them down. They slept in their clothes, ready to run. They kept bottles of cyanide in their pockets, terrified of being captured alive and tortured. Irina, holding her daughter, had to prepare herself for the possibility that she would have to kill her own child to save her from the Bolsheviks. In April 1918, the Germans invaded the Crimea. It was a bizarre liberation. The enemy they had been fighting for 4 years was now their savior. The Germans drove out the Bolsheviks and lifted the siege of Julber, but it was a temporary reprieve. The Germans lost the war in November 1918, and as their army withdrew, the Red Army began to pour back into the Crimea, more vengeful than before. The window for escape was closing. The Western powers, finally realizing the fate of the Tsar, sent a rescue mission. On April 7, 1919, the British battleship HMS Marlborough appeared on the horizon, a gray steel angel sent by King George V, the Dowager Empress's nephew. The evacuation of the Crimea was the funeral procession of Imperial Russia. The Dowager Empress, stubborn to the last, refused to board the ship unless the British captain agreed to take everyone, not just the family but the servants, the tutors, the maids, everyone who would be killed if left behind. The captain, overwhelmed, agreed. Irina stood on the deck of the Marlborough as it weighed anchor. She watched the coastline of the Crimea, the cypress trees, the white palaces, the mountains where she had played as a child, slowly recede into the mist. She was leaving behind everything. Her palaces were gone. Her title was meaningless. Her friends were dead. Her cousin, the Tsar, was a pile of ash in a Siberian forest. She was 24 years old. She had a husband who was a marked man, a daughter who had no country, and a box of jewels that represented the last fragments of the Yusupov fortune. As the Russian shore disappeared, Irina Alexandrovna turned her back on the east and looked toward the west, toward a life of exile that would be defined not by the power she wielded, but by the dignity with which she endured its loss. The Marlborough carried them to Malta, then to London. But the reception was not what they expected. The world had changed. The Romanovs were no longer the rulers of 1/6 of the Earth's surface. They were an embarrassment. They were refugees with expensive tastes and tragic stories. And the courts of Europe were tired of war and tragedy. The Yusupovs eventually drifted to Paris, the capital of the white Russian diaspora. In 1920, Paris was a city of lights and shadows, a place where jazz was beginning to play in the cellars, and the scars of the trenches were still fresh on the streets. It was here, in a city that was both welcoming and indifferent, that Irina and Felix would attempt to reinvent themselves. They had survived the Bolsheviks, but now they faced a more banal, grinding enemy, the monthly rent. They arrived with their fame intact. Felix was still the man who killed Rasputin, but their liquidity was drying up. The Rembrandts they had rolled up and smuggled out were sold to American collectors. The diamonds were being pawned one by one at Cartier and Van Cleef and Arpels, often for a fraction of their value. The Yusupov hoard was hemorrhaging. But they were young, beautiful, and famous. And in the 1920s, that was a currency of its own. They decided not to fade away into genteel poverty. They decided to become a brand. If the world wanted Romanov glamour, they would sell it to them by the yard. They bought a house in Boulogne-sur-Seine, a suburb of Paris. And then, in a move that shocked their royal relatives, they went into trade. They opened a fashion house. They called it IRFE, the first two letters of Irina and the first two of Felix. It was a bold, desperate, and glamorous gamble. They were going to monetize their own legend. But as Irina would soon discover, the world of commerce was a shark tank, and the Romanovs, for all their history, were just minnows swimming in dangerous waters. This venture into the commercial world was a desperate bid for survival. Yet in true Romanov fashion, they executed it with a style that masked the panic. When the doors of their new enterprise finally opened, it wasn't just a store, it was a sanctuary of the past, a physical manifestation of the memories they were trying to sell. In the heart of Paris, at 19 Rue Dufault, the new sign above the door read simply, IRFE. To the casual passerby, it was just another boutique in a city teeming with fashion. But to those who knew the secret language of the exile community, it was a portal to a lost dimension. Inside, the air didn't smell like a shop. It smelled like the Winter Palace, a heady mix of expensive tobacco, beeswax, and a specific melancholic perfume called limoni, which the Romanovs had favored. The mannequins who walked the floor were not anonymous girls from the provinces. They were countesses, baronesses, and grand duchesses, women who had once danced at the Tsar's balls and were now earning their bread by modeling silk for American tourists. And at the center of this surreal, glittering enterprise stood Irina. The launch of the IRFE fashion house in 1924 was not merely a business venture. It was a defiant act of cultural preservation. Irina and Felix had decided that if they could not regain their throne, they would at least dictate the style of the age. Irina became the face of the brand. She was almost 30 years old, but the trauma of the revolution had refined her beauty into something sharp, modern, and haunting. With her short hair, her pale skin, and those immense tragic eyes, she was the physical embodiment of the 1920s aesthetic, the garçon look, but with an imperial twist. She didn't look like a flapper having fun. She looked like a goddess in mourning. The success was immediate and intoxicating. The world was fascinated by the prince assassin and his beautiful wife. Buying a dress from IRFE wasn't just purchasing a garment. It was buying a souvenir of the apocalypse. Wealthy women from New York and London flocked to the Rue Dufault, thrilled by the prospect of being served tea by a woman who had called the Tsar Uncle Nicky. They paid exorbitant prices for gowns embroidered with Russian pearls and tunics painted by Felix himself. For a few glorious years, the money poured in. The Yusupovs opened branches in Touquet, London, and Berlin. They launched a perfume line. They were the toast of Paris, proving that the Romanovs were not dead. They had simply relocated to the fashion district. But beneath the velvet and the silk, the rot was setting in. Neither Irina nor Felix had any concept of business. They ran IRFE like a feudal estate, not a corporation. Felix, with his characteristic generosity and lack of discipline, treated the shop as an extension of his wardrobe. He would give expensive dresses away to friends who couldn't afford them. He would invite the entire staff, dozens of models and seamstresses, to lavish dinners at Maxim's, putting the bill on the company account. He hired fellow refugees not because they were skilled, but because they were hungry. It was a beautiful, disastrous charity disguised as capitalism. Irina tried to maintain order, but she was fighting a losing battle against her husband's chaotic nature and the economic tides of history. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the luxury market evaporated overnight. The American heiresses stopped coming. The debts mounted. By 1930, the dream of IRFE was over. The shop closed its doors, the perfumes were discounted, and the Yusupovs were once again facing the terrified vertigo of insolvency. They retreated to their house in Boulogne-sur-Seine, surrounded by unsold dresses and unpaid bills, watching the shadows lengthen across Europe. It was in this vulnerable, precarious state that the past reached out to strike Irina one more time, leading to the most public and controversial battle of her life. The blow did not come from a Bolshevik assassin or a debt collector, but from the dream factory of Hollywood. In 1932, the mighty studio Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer released a blockbuster film titled Rasputin and the Empress. It was intended to be the cinema event of the decade, starring the royal family of Broadway, the three Barrymore siblings, John, Ethel, and Lionel, playing the Romanovs. It was a high-budget, sensational retelling of the fall of the Russian Empire, dripping with melodrama and historical inaccuracy. To the producers in California, the story of Rasputin was just a script, a gothic horror story to sell popcorn. They didn't care about the nuances of Russian history. They cared about drama. And to heighten the drama, they invented a character. They called her Princess Natasha. In the film, Princess Natasha is a lady-in-waiting to the Empress, a beautiful young woman who is the fiancée of the Prince Chigodiev. The film depicts Rasputin played with terrifying menace by Lionel Barrymore, becoming obsessed with Natasha. In the film's most shocking sequence, Rasputin hypnotizes Natasha in his apartment. The camera fades to black, but the implication is brutal and unmistakable. He rapes her. The film then suggests that it is this sexual violation that drives the prince to murder Rasputin. The assassination is portrayed not as a political act to save the monarchy, but as a husband's revenge for the defilement of his woman. When the film premiered in Europe, word reached the Yusupov house in Paris. Friends called them horrified. "You must see it," they whispered. "It is an abomination." Irina went to a cinema in Paris to watch the film. One can only imagine the cold, suffocating horror she must have felt as she sat in the dark. She saw a woman on screen who looked like her, dressed like her, occupying her place in history. She saw this woman being pawed, hypnotized, and violated by the man her husband had killed. The audience around her gasped and thrilled at the scandal, believing they were watching a secret history. MGM had even marketed the film with the tagline, "Some of the principals are still alive." For Irina, this was not just a movie. It was a psychic assault. For 15 years, she had lived with the stigma of being the bait for the murder. But she had always held on to one truth. She had never met Rasputin. He had never touched her. Her hands were clean. Now Hollywood was rewriting her life, telling the world that she was not just a conspirator, but a victim of sexual violence by the most reviled man in history. It was a humiliation so profound it threatened to destroy the last shreds of her dignity. Felix was enraged, ranting about duels and honor, but Irina was cold steel. She did something that deposed royalty rarely did, something that required a nerve of iron. She sued. The case of Yusupov vs. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was filed in the English courts in 1934. It seemed like a suicide mission, a refugee princess with no money attacking the biggest, richest corporation in the world. MGM had an army of lawyers, a bottomless war chest, in the arrogance of an industry that believed it owned reality. They laughed at the lawsuit. They argued that Princess Natasha was a fictional composite, a dramatic device, not Irina. They argued that since Irina's name wasn't used, she had no case. But they underestimated the British legal system, and they severely underestimated Irina Alexandrovna. The trial became a global sensation. It was The Beauty and the Beast played out in the High Court of Justice in London. The Yusupovs hired Sir Patrick Hastings, one of the most brilliant and feared barristers in England. Hastings knew that to win, he didn't need to prove that MGM was malicious. He just needed to prove that a reasonable person watching the film would believe Princess Natasha was Irina. Irina took the stand. It was the performance of her life, but it was not acting. She was dressed in black, wearing a hat with a small veil, looking every inch the aggrieved imperial highness. She spoke in a low, clear voice. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply told the truth. I have never met Rasputin, she told the hushed courtroom. He has never been in my presence. The events depicted in this film are a lie. The MGM lawyers tried to bully her. They asked if she was not, in fact, the wife of the murderer. Yes. Was she not the niece of the Tsar? Yes. Did she not leave Russia after the murder? Yes. Then how, they insinuated, was the character not her? Sir Patrick Hastings countered with a masterful interrogation of the MGM experts. He forced them to admit that the film was marketed as based on true events. He pointed out that the prince character in the film killed Rasputin in the exact same way Felix did. He pointed out that the princess character was the prince's wife. Who else, Hastings thundered to the jury, could this woman possibly be? The turning point came when the film was screened for the jury. They watched the rape scene. They looked at the fragile, dignified woman sitting in the witness box. The contrast between the tawdry Hollywood fiction and the undeniable reality of Irina's pain was overwhelming. The jury didn't just find in her favor. They delivered a verdict that shook the film industry to its foundations. They awarded Irina £25,000 in damages. In 1934, this was a staggering fortune, equivalent to millions of dollars today. It was one of the largest libel settlements in legal history. But the money was secondary. The legal precedent was the true victory. The judge ruled that to depict a living person in a film and falsely attribute shameful acts to them was libelous, even if the name was changed. MGM was forced to withdraw the film from circulation. They had to cut the offending scenes. And in a detail that affects every single person watching a movie today, the studios were so terrified of being sued again by someone like Irina that they created a mandatory legal shield. That standard disclaimer you see at the beginning of every movie and TV show, the characters and events depicted in this photoplay are fictitious. Any similarity to any person living or dead is merely coincidental, exists because of Irina Romanov. It is her legacy, a permanent scar on the face of Hollywood, a reminder of the time a Russian princess forced the dream merchants to admit they were lying. With the settlement money, the Yusupovs were saved. The £25,000 bought them a reprieve from poverty. It allowed them to fix the roof of the house in Bologna, to pay off their debts, and to live with a degree of comfort for the next decade. But it was a victory won at a terrible emotional cost. The trial had dragged the Rasputin scandal back into the light. For months, the newspapers had printed the words Rasputin, rape, and Yusupov in the same headlines. Irina had cleared her name, but she had also cemented her association with the tragedy. She had won the battle for truth, but she had lost the war for oblivion. Following the trial, Irina retreated further into the shadows. The 1930s were waning, and the clouds of a new war were gathering. Life in the house at Rue Pierre-Guérin settled into a strange, eccentric rhythm. Felix, buoyed by the publicity of the trial, began to write his memoirs. He was eager to tell his side of the story again, to polish the legend of the patriotic assassin. He gave interviews. He remained a public figure. Irina, conversely, became the silent partner in the truest sense. She tolerated Felix's need for attention, understanding that it was his way of coping with the loss of his world. She managed the household, dealing with the endless stream of Russian refugees who came to their door asking for help. Even when they were low on funds, Irina never turned a countryman away. She would give them a meal, a coat, or a few francs. She became a quiet matriarch of the exile community, a woman who had lost everything but still had something to give. But the dynamic between them was shifting. Felix was becoming increasingly difficult, his behavior more erratic, his sexuality more open. He surrounded himself with a court of young men, sycophants who flattered him to drink his wine. Irina watched this with a detached, almost saintly patience. She did not judge him. They slept in separate rooms, lived separate internal lives, but remained bound by a loyalty that was stronger than love. They were the only two people on earth who understood what it meant to be them. They were the survivors of the shipwreck, clinging to the same piece of driftwood. Then came 1939, the invasion of Poland, the start of World War II. For Irina, this was a nightmare recurring. Once again, the world was at war. Once again, Russia was the enemy. But this time, they were not in a palace in St. Petersburg. They were in a suburb of Paris, directly in the path of the German army. When the Wehrmacht marched into Paris in June 1940, the Yusupovs did not flee. They were too old, too tired, and frankly, too fatalistic to run again. They stayed in their house. And then a strange thing happened. German officers began to knock on their door. These officers were not there to arrest them. They were there as tourists. They wanted to meet the man who killed Rasputin. The Nazi elite, with their obsession with the occult and history, were fascinated by Felix. They treated the Yusupovs with a bizarre deference. They offered them protection. They asked for autographs. It was a grotesque situation. Irina had to serve tea to men wearing the uniform of the invaders, men who were destroying Europe, just as the Bolsheviks had destroyed Russia. But she did it. She played the part. She used her German connections to keep her family safe. But behind the polite facade, she was terrified. Her son-in-law, Count Sheremetev, was fighting in the war. Her friends were disappearing. And there was a rumor, a terrifying whisper, that Hitler wanted to restore the Tsarist throne as a puppet regime and was looking for a Romanov to sit on it. Felix, with his reckless mouth, refused to cooperate with the Nazis politically. When approached by German agents who wanted him to endorse the invasion of Russia, Felix refused. "I'm a Russian," he reportedly said. "I may hate the Bolsheviks, but I will not help you destroy my country. It was a moment of unexpected nobility from the decadent prince, but it put them in grave danger. For the rest of the war, they lived under the microscope of the Gestapo. Their passports were confiscated. They were forbidden to leave Paris. They were prisoners, once again, not of the Red Guards, but of the Black Shirts. Through the dark winters of the occupation, Irina kept the fire burning in the Rue Pierre-Guérin. They had no coal. They burned furniture to keep warm. They ate turnip soup. The diamonds were gone. The lawsuit money was gone. They were just two old people shivering in the dark, listening to the RAF bombers overhead, waiting for liberation or death. But the Firebird does not burn easily. Irina Alexandrovna had survived the fall of the Winter Palace, the flight from the Crimea, the poverty of exile, and the humiliation of Hollywood. She would survive the Nazis too. She was saving her strength for the final act, for the long, slow fade into the history books, where she would have to fight one last battle, the battle against being forgotten. But even the darkest nights eventually yield to dawn, though the morning light can be harsh on old ghosts. As the war ground to a halt and the occupation lifted, the Yusupovs emerged from the shadows not into a restoration of glory, but into a strange new world that had moved on without them. When the tanks of the Free French Army rolled down the Champs-Élysées in August 1944, liberating Paris from 4 years of Nazi occupation, the bells of Notre Dame rang out across a city that was drunk on joy. But in the small, overgrown garden of the house on Rue Pierre-Guérin, the mood was one of quiet exhaustion. Irina and Felix had survived. They had outlasted the Kaiser, the Bolsheviks, the Great Depression, and now Hitler. But the victory felt hollow. They were entering their 50s and 60s, and the world that was emerging from the smoke of World War II was a world of atomic bombs, Cold War spies, and American consumerism, a world that had absolutely no place for aging Russian aristocrats. The post-war years were the autumn of the patriarchs for the Yusupovs. The adrenaline of survival that had fueled them since 1917 began to fade, replaced by a slow, creeping reality of irrelevance. The Paris of the 1920s, the Paris of the White Russian exiles, of Grand Dukes driving taxis and countesses running tea rooms, was gone. That generation was dying out. The younger generation of Russians born in exile spoke French better than Russian and had no memory of the snows of St. Petersburg. Irina and Felix were becoming dinosaurs, the last living specimens of a species that had gone extinct. Their house in the Boulogne-sur-Seine suburb became a strange, magical, and decaying fortress. It was a place out of time. Visitors who came to the door described the experience as stepping into a Chekhov play that had been left running for too long. The paint was peeling. The roof leaked, requiring an intricate system of buckets to catch the rainwater. The heating was temperamental, leaving the high-ceilinged rooms permanently chilly. But inside, amidst the shabbiness, there were flashes of blinding splendor. A velvet curtain torn from a palace window, a gold icon frame resting on a cheap wooden table, a portrait of the Tsar hanging next to a crack in the plaster, and at the center of this domestic ruin sat Irina. She had transformed into a figure of profound dignity. Her hair was gray now, often pulled back in a severe bun. She dressed simply, often in black, wearing clothes she had mended herself. The woman who had once owned a diamond dowry that could bankrupt a small nation was now the woman who knew exactly how much a baguette cost at the local bakery. Yet her presence was more imperial than ever. When she poured tea from a chipped porcelain pot, she did it with the same grace she had used at the Winter Palace. She didn't act like a poor woman. She acted like a queen in temporary reduced circumstances. Life with Felix in these final decades was a test of patience that would have broken a lesser woman. As he aged, Felix did not mellow. He crystallized. He became more eccentric, more talkative, and more obsessed with his own legend. He realized that their only remaining asset was his infamy. To pay the bills, he wrote his memoirs, Lost Splendor. He gave interviews to journalists who came to gawk at the man who killed Rasputin. He told the story of the murder over and over again, embellishing the details, acting out the parts, reveling in the attention. For Irina, this must have been a special kind of torture. She, who hated the scandal, who wanted the name Rasputin to be buried forever, had to listen to her husband perform the tragedy of their lives for cash. She would sit in the corner of the room while Felix held court smoking her cigarette, her face a mask of polite detachment. Occasionally, Felix would turn to her for confirmation. "Isn't that right, Irina? The cyanide didn't work." And she would nod, a silent accomplice to the myth-making that kept them fed. There is a heartbreaking anecdote from the 1950s that perfectly encapsulates their dynamic. A visitor arrived at the house to interview the prince. They found Felix in the drawing room, wearing a silk dressing gown, looking every inch the decadent aristocrat. But where was the princess? The visitor eventually found the granddaughter of Tsar Alexander III in the kitchen, on her knees, scrubbing the floor. When the visitor protested, Irina simply smiled and said, "Someone has to do it, and we cannot afford a maid this month." This was the hidden heroism of Irina Alexandrovna. Felix was the showman. Irina was the stage manager. She was the one who negotiated with the grocer for credit. She was the one who kept the peace with the neighbors when Felix's behavior became too erratic. She was the one who nurtured their daughter, Irina, and their granddaughter, Xenia, trying to give them a sense of normalcy in a house built on ghosts. But the ghosts were always there. As the 1960s arrived, bringing with it the Beatles, miniskirts, and the sexual revolution, the Yusupovs became counterculture icons in a weird, ironic twist. Hippies and young bohemians began to seek them out. To the youth of the 60s, Felix, the cross-dressing, bisexual, mystic-killing rebel, was a precursor to their own rebellion. They came to the door with flowers and questions about the occult. Irina watched this parade with bemused bewilderment. She saw her husband, a man born in the 19th century under an absolute monarchy, being celebrated by long-haired radicals who wanted to overthrow the government. It was absurd, but it was also survival. If the hippies brought wine and cheese, they were welcome. However, the shadow of death was beginning to circle closer. In the mid-1960s, Felix's health began to fail. The energy that had sustained him for so long, the nervous, frantic energy of the survivor, finally ran out. He became frail, his memory began to slip, and the prettiest boy in Russia withered into a ghost of himself. The relationship between Irina and Felix in these final months was the culmination of 50 years of loyalty. Irina became his nurse. She fed him. She washed him. She sat by his bedside for hours, holding the hand that had pulled the trigger. They had been through everything together. They were the only two people left who remembered the specific shade of blue of the Neva River in winter, the sound of the bells at Easter in the Kremlin, the terror of the basement in the Moika. They were a civilization of two. On September 27, 1967, Prince Felix Yusupov died. He was 80 years old. The man who had dodged the Yusupov curse, who had escaped the Bolshevik firing squads, and who had outlived his own notoriety, finally slipped away quietly in his bed. His death was the severing of the final thread. For Irina, it was a catastrophe of the soul. Felix had been her husband, yes, but he had also been her child, her burden, and her identity. For half a century, she had been Yusupov's wife. She had spent every day worrying about him, protecting him, cleaning up his messes. Now suddenly, the silence in the house was deafening. There was no one to protect. The problem child was gone. The funeral was held at the Russian Orthodox Church in Sainte-Geneviève-des-Bois, the final resting place of the Russian emigration. It was a somber affair. The cameras were there, of course. The journalists wrote their obituaries about the killer of Rasputin, but few wrote about the woman standing by the open grave. Irina stood there, a small black-clad figure against the gray Paris sky. She was 72 years old. She had buried her parents. She had buried her siblings. She had buried her world. And now she was burying the man who had dragged her through the fire. As the coffin was lowered into the earth, observers noted that Irina did not weep. The tears had been used up long ago. She stood with that same terrifying, regal composure that had silenced the courtroom in London 30 years earlier. But inside, the light had gone out. She returned to the empty house in Boulogne. The next 3 years were a slow, fading coda to a symphony that had already ended. Irina lived on, but she was merely waiting. She spent her days organizing Felix's papers, sorting through the photographs of a life that looked like a fairy tale to everyone else but felt like a trial by endurance to her. She withdrew almost completely from the world. She stopped giving interviews. She stopped going out. She became a spectral figure, seen only occasionally by the neighbors, walking slowly in the overgrown garden, talking to her cats. She was the last custodian of the Romanov memory, but she had no one left to share it with. One day, shortly before her own end, she was asked by a young relative about the murder. Was it worth it? They asked. Did killing him change anything? Irina looked at them with those deep, dark, ancient eyes. She didn't speak of politics or empires. She reportedly said, "It destroyed Felix, and it destroyed me. We killed a man and the world applauded, but God does not applaud." It was the final verdict of the Firebird. The realization that the great dramatic act of their lives, the act that had made them famous, was ultimately a tragedy of errors. They had tried to stop the clock, but they had only broken the mechanism. In February 1970, the winter winds of Paris blew cold against the windows of the Rue Pierre-Guérin. Irina Alexandrovna took to her bed. Her heart, tired from 74 years of beating against the current of history, was ready to stop. The end was not a dramatic curtain fall, but a quiet slipping away. The Firebird had flown through the storm for as long as her wings could carry her, and now finally the wind had died down. On February 26, 1970, the silence that Princess Irina Alexandrovna had courted for so long finally claimed her completely. She died in the house on Rue Pierre-Guérin, surrounded by the faded velvet and the chipped porcelain of a life that had spanned 2 centuries and 2 distinct realities. She was 74 years old. There was no 101-gun salute, no weeping crowds on the Nevsky Prospect, no court couriers galloping to spread the news. There was just the quiet, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor stopping, and the soft exhalation of a woman who had carried the weight of the Romanov tragedy on her shoulders for 53 years. Her death went largely unnoticed by the world at large. The newspapers ran brief obituaries, mostly framing her in relation to the men in her life. Niece of the Tsar dies, or widow of Rasputin's killer passes away. Even in death, she was struggling to be seen as the protagonist of her own story. But for those who knew the history of the exile, her passing marked the final closing of the book. She was the last Grand Duchess who had truly lived the life of the imperial court as an adult. With her, the memory of the winter balls, the smell of the incense in the private chapels, and the terror of the revolution passed from living memory into the cold storage of history books. She was buried alongside Felix in the Sainte-Geneviève-des-Bois Russian cemetery, located in the southern suburbs of Paris. This cemetery is perhaps the most melancholy place on earth. It is a necropolis of the lost empire, a forest of white crosses, where generals, dancers, princes, and poets lie under the birch trees, eternally separated from the motherland they loved. Irina was laid to rest in the same grave as her husband. It was a final poetic irony. In life, she had been his anchor, his protector, the sane half of a mad partnership. Now she would lie beside him forever, the guardian angel still on duty, keeping watch over the enfant terrible of the Russian aristocracy. But if we leave Irina there, buried under a stone cross in a French suburb, we miss the true magnitude of her legacy. Her story did not end with her death. In fact, the ripples of her life are still felt in the most unexpected places today. The most tangible piece of her legacy is one that you likely encounter every single week without realizing it. Every time you sit down to watch a movie and that legal disclaimer flashes by, the characters and events depicted in this photoplay are fictitious. Any similarity to any person living or dead is merely coincidental. You're seeing Irina Romanov's ghost written in legal ink. Lawyers call it the Rasputin clause, born from the day a shy, introverted princess dragged MGM into court and refused to let Hollywood steal her dignity. When she sued MGM in 1934, she didn't just win money, she changed the architecture of storytelling. She established the right of a living person to own their history, to say, "You cannot take my pain and turn it into your entertainment without my permission." In a world that was rapidly becoming obsessed with celebrity and exploitation, Irina drew a line in the sand. She forced the 20th century to respect the honor of the 19th. It is a strange modern monument for a Romanov, not a statue in a square, but a sentence in a contract. Yet it fits her perfectly. It is a legacy of protection, of silence, and of boundaries. But beyond the legal battles and the famous husband, what is the true meaning of Irina Alexandrovna? Why does she matter to us, sitting here decades later? She matters because she represents the hardest kind of heroism, the heroism of endurance. We are conditioned to look for heroes who charge into battle, who make speeches, who die glorious deaths. We romanticize the Romanovs who were murdered, Nicholas, Alexandra, the beautiful children. Their deaths were tragic, yes, but they were also final. They didn't have to live with the aftermath. They didn't have to learn how to be poor. They didn't have to answer the door to creditors. Irina did. She faced the long defeat. She woke up every morning for 50 years knowing that her world was gone, that her title was a joke to the modern world, and that her husband was a man defined by a murder. She could have crumbled. She could have become bitter like her mother-in-law. She could have abandoned Felix and lived a quiet, comfortable life elsewhere. She could have sold her story to the tabloids for quick cash. She did none of those things. She chose dignity. She chose loyalty. She chose to sew her husband's trousers and scrub her own floors rather than compromise who she was. She proved that nobility is not about the crown you wear, but about the spine you possess. In the end, the story of Princess Irina is a corrective to the myth of Rasputin. For a century, we have been obsessed with the mad monk, the eyes, the beard, the mysticism. We have been obsessed with Felix, the glamour, the poison, the gun. We have focused on the loud, chaotic, destructive elements of the story. But while the men were busy destroying the empire and killing each other, Irina was the one holding the pieces together. She was the diamond refugee. She was the woman who walked out of the Winter Palace with a suitcase and a baby and walked into the modern world without breaking stride. She survived the revolution, the exile, the poverty, the Nazis, and Hollywood. She defeated them all, not with a sword, but with an icy, unbreakable silence. History is a cruel creditor. It usually demands that women like Irina be victims, tragic, weeping figures in the background of great men. But Irina refused the role. She wasn't a victim of the Rasputin affair. She was its only survivor. And as we look back at the wreckage of the Romanov dynasty, past the blood and the jewels and the madness, we see her standing there at the end of it all, tall, unsmiling, dressed in black, the last firebird who refused to burn, staring down the camera with eyes that had seen the end of the world and decided quite simply to keep living. She was Irina, and she was enough.